Ever had the opportunity to talk to someone who was involved in something that was really big or really significant? I remember a couple years ago, there's a gentleman, and I was actually looking at doing some work in his house, and he had a picture on his wall of the moon landing. And we got talking about it, and it was interesting because it's cool, but you don't go to most people's house and see a picture of a moon landing on the wall. It's just not there. Well, this gentleman had been the one in charge of the project to design the power supply to power everything that was needed for this moon landing, which I was like, well, I guess you probably had to have some power there. And he was telling about it, and it was just like yesterday. Like, he was so involved in it, so engaged in it, and it was awesome. And he wasn't the one walking on the moon, but the way he told it, I mean, it wouldn't have happened without him, and I think that's probably right. Sometimes you talk to someone who was engaged in a great building project, and it was like this building, and they're just so enamored with it. And it doesn't matter whether they're the one that's sweeping up the floors, the engineer that's kind of making sure the structure's all going to stand up, or the architect that's making it beautiful, or the contractors that put all the pieces together. There's this pride, and there's a peace, that there's this enthusiasm. You kind of see it particularly, a lot of veterans from World War II in particular. They knew what the mission was, they believed in what the mission was, and they were proud to have served that mission. And talking to them, regardless of the role that they had, they knew and understood how it fit into this bigger picture. There's this beauty to that. I think it's even one of maybe the best examples of this is when you see kids and for all the work and all the energy that's put into them and developing and nurturing and training and disciplining. And then there's those moments where you're like, it's coming together. Like, it's so exciting. It's awesome. And, you get to see this young life, or maybe not quite as young life, doing things that you're like, wow, I'm so proud. I'm so enthusiastic. And I would fully acknowledge, man, it's not all me, or it's not all the things that I did, but like just to have a part in that is something really, really special. That's really magnificent. And I think we're sitting here today as we're continuing our series in the book of Acts, is that if we're a follower of Jesus, we are part of something that's truly magnificent. Now, it doesn't mean that we're the top person of this magnificent piece, but the opportunity and the role that God has allowed us to be a part of is something truly incredible. And I think we can see it so often. Maybe we experience it that we kind of take it for granted, or maybe even worse, when we see it doesn't work like it's supposed to, we kind of say oh, well, that's messed up, or that's broken. And yet, by doing so, we acknowledge that the standard that was set up was actually a magnificent standard, and what we're reacting to is a standard that nobody else holds to, but that we kind of wish or desire it was a little bit better. So we're going to look at the book of Acts this morning. Paul, if we remember, has been going around the known world at the time, spreading the gospel, the good news about Jesus, that Jesus died and paid the penalty for sin and rose from the grave. And this created some enthusiastic followers of Jesus, and also created some animosity. Because as he was going around, people were like, well, what does that mean about our gods or our deities that we're worshiping? Or how does this affect our business? Or how does this affect our power in the community? And so there was this mixed reaction everywhere that Paul and the gospel went. And that is still the case today. That the gospel does create this mixed reaction. This good news creates a mixed reaction. We're going to look at the book of Acts this morning. Paul now is in Jerusalem. This is when we had come to Jerusalem. We, as this group that Paul's traveling with, so Luke, the author of the book of Acts, had been part of this, and there's several others that are traveling with Paul. When we came to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. So James would have been, seems like the de facto head of the church in Jerusalem. And so Paul is now traveling around, and all the original apostles are largely kind of centrally located still in Jerusalem. The church is very Jerusalem-based still. And so when he's gone on all these trips, he's coming back to Jerusalem. And he's coming back to them, and he's coming to the elders to meet with them. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. This is Paul coming back, and he's saying, hey, I'm eager to share with you everything that God has been doing. Some of us know this experience, this feeling. You go on a great vacation, or you come back and you want to tell your family and friends, like, piece by piece, every single piece that has been done. I was on a trip with my seminary education about a decade plus ago, and there was this one gentleman that had, like these old school video cameras, like not the phones, like, the old school ones I'm talking about, like they weigh like 35 pounds kind of thing. This guy was insistent on videotaping everything. We went through the Jordan, and we were driving in the bus, and this guy stood up in the bus, and I think it was a 3.5-hour trip from where we were going, and the whole time, he's just rocking back and forth, videotaping. Desert. I mean, complete desert. And all I can think is like, oh, his poor kids, I mean, he's going to get back and want to show them and sit down. I want to show you 3.5 hours of desert. And it's going to be awesome, But we naturally have that. We're excited about different things, right? But we naturally have that, like things that we love and experience. We want to share that joy, that enthusiasm. And here, even more importantly, Paul is actually recounting all these missionary journeys, all the things that God has done. Now, I think this is fascinating. He starts off saying, hey, here's not all the places I'm starting, but the focus here is what God has accomplished. And Paul's saying, like, hey, I got to go to all these places, but God did amazing things throughout this journey. But there's also this piece, he did it among the Gentiles through his ministry, that Paul believed and lived this partnership with God. That's like, Paul's like, God gave me this opportunity, and look what he's done. He gets all the credit for all of the good things that have done. And so he's sharing this with them. Now, he's saying one by one. I kind of wonder how long that took for Paul. Like, is this like a 30-minute synopsis? Is this like we're going to be here for a couple of days and we're going to break this down? But nonetheless, he's going through this ministry and showing all the things that God's accomplished. When this is the James and the elders in Jerusalem, they heard it, they glorified God. So how do we know that Paul's focus was on God? Well, the response of the church was also to God. So they hear all the things that God's doing, and they're like, wow. Like, these are things that only God could accomplish. These are things that only God could do. Like, these are above the capabilities of Paul or Peter or any of the other elders. Like, these are the things that God alone can do. And they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. So then it kind of a sort of an opportunity to maybe swap stories a little bit, right? So Paul is telling them, like, all the journeys of God, or all the journeys of throughout a known world, all the things that God's done. They rejoice with Paul. They're like, man, God has accomplished amazing things. And then they're kind of saying, like, well, while you've been gone in Jerusalem, there are thousands of Jews who have put their faith and trust in Jesus. And that's happened while he's gone, which I think this is amazing, that both of them are recounting stories about how God is at work. And so the first piece here is that God is working. And if we ever lose sight of this or ever get beyond this or we ever think this is about us, we've missed the whole point. Is that, like, it's not about me or it's not about you or it's not about necessarily us. In a sense that, yes, there is a piece that we have a responsibility, we have an opportunity, we have a commission. But ultimately, what we desire, what God wants, is that God needs to work. And if God doesn't work, nothing else really matters. And so what we should be craving after and desiring in our own lives is the working of God. And here we see both in all of Turkey and Greece, they're celebrating the working of God. And then back in Jerusalem, they're celebrating the working of God. And so the first part that this starts off is just that this reflection is that God is working. This conversation continues between Paul and the elders there. It says, all those that have come to Jesus, they are zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles, or non-Jewish people, to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to walk according to our customs. So here they're kind of they've gone through this time of celebration and story swapping. They're like, okay, now we have a potential issue on the horizon. So in Jerusalem and in the area, the church was largely Jewish in composition. That's where the church started. That's where Jesus' ministry was. Most of the 12 disciples, 12 apostles, or 11 after Judas, they were centered in this Jerusalem area. And so this early church was largely Jewish. Even Paul, when he was traveling around, he started in the synagogue, which is where the Jewish people would gather. And then once he got kicked out, thrown out, or beaten out of the synagogue, then he'd go to the rest of the non-Jewish people. And so what they're saying is, okay, they're telling Paul, like, hey, while you've been away, thousands have come to Jesus. Thousands have put their faith and trust in Jesus as the Messiah. The problem is that, well, they've been talking about you, Paul, and they're told that among the Gentiles, you're telling them to forsake Moses. So the message is that the church is wrestling with is like, okay, Paul's coming back. We're excited to hear Paul. We're excited to hear all the things that God has done. But how do we kind of handle the situation where we can see God's working through Paul, and yet in this early church, what you have is a situation where many of the Jewish people kind of think Paul is trying to turn people away from the Jewish customs. And they're telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. So this is the message going out about Paul. They ask, what then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. So these church leaders are like, okay, on one hand, we're thrilled that Paul is here. On the other hand, like there's these messages going out that Paul is encouraging Jewish people to stop being Jewish to follow Jesus. And they're concerned about this conflict. They're concerned about this division. Like they acknowledge and understand they're both celebrating the work of God. They understand it's the work of God in different locations, in different spheres, but they're concerned about exactly how this works together. And we see that division has threatened God's work. That there's now this threat on the horizon is that, okay, in the midst of all these good things, there's this potential problem. And there's this potential threat. Well, how do they handle this threat? How do they handle this? Well, it says, do therefore what we tell you. So they're telling this to Paul, which I think is very bold to be telling Paul this. Paul doesn't seem like he gets told what to do a lot. But they says, hey, do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their head. This is part of this festive ritual and vow there. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance to the law. So what they're saying is, okay, like we've got a problem. They're going to think Paul's coming in here, and he's going to tell all the Jewish people to no longer follow the customs of the Jewish people. So they're saying, okay, well, if you actually go to the temple and observe the vows with them, everyone's going to see that like you're not here to destroy the Old Testament or to destroy the customs. You're here just to share that Jesus is the promised Messiah. So this is kind of their solution. But they're saying, but as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. What are they referencing here? Well, they're referencing Acts chapter 15, where there's this divide or this tension in the early church. It was like, okay, those who come to Jesus, like who are not Jewish by background, do they need to follow all the same practices and rituals that they did before coming to Jesus? Now, if you've had the opportunity to hang out with a different family or to marry into a different family during holidays, it's interesting that the traditions and the rituals that get established, right? And sometimes the traditions actually like don't logistically work together, or you're like, well, this is not how we did it. And we can look at this and say like, oh, like, well, it's not a big deal. Like, what is the deal? But yet our traditions we hold to very dearly. Like, and they're very special and precious to us, and we don't want to change them, the ones that make sense for anybody. And so, and in this same way, this early church is wrestling with that. It's like the Old Testament was pointing towards Jesus. The entirety of the Old Testament was pointing towards Jesus. And yet there's these other pieces that became in place that were reminders and festivals and ways of dressing. And all these things are still pointing to Jesus. But yet when someone comes from a non-Jewish background, they're like, we don't understand any of this. Like they're just trying to understand like sin and salvation and the resurrection and adding all of this on top. Like the early church was like, well, this isn't the point, is to add all these pieces onto it, because if they've already found Jesus, all these things pointing them to Jesus aren't necessary to come to Jesus. Okay? So we get these two groups. So the Jewish leaders here are saying, hey, you're in Jerusalem now, and in Jerusalem, like, let's follow along with the customs so that you don't turn people away from the gospel. But they said, outside of Jerusalem, remember that we actually said, no, like, it's not necessary. Those who are not Jewish by background, don't dump all these other things on top of them. That's not the important piece. And the piece that they mentioned here, this is right from Acts chapter 15. They're basically making, some of these are just acknowledgments to the Jewish believers, the other believers there. And it seems like even over time, you get to the book of Corinthians, some of these modify just a little bit. But they're like, hey, like, the important point is that, the important piece is that people need to come to know Jesus. And so they're saying, when you're not in Jerusalem, like, don't put extra pressure, extra burden on the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people. But in Jerusalem, to not kind of follow these traditions is going to create and distract from Jesus. So the main focus piece is, like, don't distract from Jesus by either, like, disrupting unnecessarily or adding on to unnecessarily. So then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them, and they went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them. So Paul listens to this, and he says, like, seems like it makes sense to him. Seems like it's a good plan to him, because he does exactly what they recommend. They say, okay, like, I'm back in Jerusalem. You guys are the ones in Jerusalem. You guys understand the culture that's current in Jerusalem. Absolutely. He jumps in and does exactly what their recommendation is. And what we see here is that mutual love offers the opportunity to overcome. I think this is really cool. That the early church, like, they see this potential division, and they also say there's a way through this, or there's a way past this, there's a way we can overcome this. And how is that? Well, that's through mutual love. Now, we're not talking about just the feeling love. We're actually talking about action, like beneficial action. Paul says, hey, when I'm outside of Jerusalem, I don't need all these pieces restricting the sharing of the gospel, and so I don't do them. But when I'm in Jerusalem, I'm happy to take on some extra ritual and routine for the sake of Jesus and for the sake of the people that I'm trying to serve. And in similar fashion, the leaders in Jerusalem are like, hey, normally we have to, while we're here, this is what we have to do. But if you're outside of here, like, don't put pressure on that. And so they're both acknowledging that what they're involved in is the work of God. They're not involved in, like, the Church of Jerusalem work and then the Gentile church work. They're all involved in the work of God. And they all recognize that different areas and different customs and different culture require different things, so to not distract from the gospel. And so this mutual love, like Paul recognizing the wisdom of the elders, and James in particular in Jerusalem, and the elders and James in Jerusalem recognizing that ministry outside of Israel is different, this mutual love, this opportunity to overcome. It says, when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. Okay, all this work, all this planning, they see a problem coming, they anticipate the problem, they craft a solution. The solution seems like it's a great solution, a great plan to kind of avoid any issue. Within a week, the Jews from Asia, so they're all gathering for this feast, so they're traveling to Jerusalem from Asia. They see Paul in the temple, and they stir up the crowd. They get the crowd angry, animated. They're crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone, everywhere, against the people and the law and this place." I think this is actually a pretty good accusation, right? Like they're saying, Paul is everywhere, and everywhere he goes, he's teaching everyone. Like, that's pretty cool. Like, I mean, that's a fair. But what he's not doing, he's not teaching them against the people and the law in this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple, and he has defiled this holy place. So they're saying, man, we got to get this. This is a huge problem. Paul is here. He's defiling the temple. All the rituals, he's not followed them, which we just heard that he has. But they're upset, and they're saying, like, he's brought Greeks into there, which non-Jewish people couldn't enter the inner courts of the temple. And so they're like, I mean, he's just committed the sacrilege against this place. He's defiled it. He says, why did they say this? Well, they'd previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. I think this is interesting. He wasn't actually in the temple, but they're like, oh, we saw Paul in the city hanging out with a non-Jewish person, particularly Trophimus. He comes up a couple times in the New Testament. And because we saw him earlier in the city, he has to have been brought into the temple. I mean, we just know this. Oopsie. Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. So, man, Paul is trying to worship. He's trying to honor this festival, this feast. And he's followed the wisdom of the elders. He's done everything that he can to avoid creating a situation like this. And nonetheless, some people come in, they're like, oh, man, Paul is just creating this mayhem. And I think what's interesting with this is we saw several pieces here, but that sin divides. Like, sin divides. Like, the elders in the church and Paul were all working very hard to just keep the unity around the gospel, to worship God. And yet we see sin divides. Well, a couple of ones here, gossip for one. This rumor, hey, did you see Trophimus? Yeah, Trophimus. I heard Trophimus is there. And then pretty soon it's like, Trophimus is with Paul. Oh, yeah, no, Trophimus, he's got to be in the temple. And then got to be in the temple goes from like, he's in the temple. And it just kind of works its way and kind of spreads and shifts and changes. And next thing you know, like, the whole city's in an uproar. Because some people were sharing news that they didn't fully know and that was not true. We also see lies in this one. They're accusing Paul of actually speaking against this place in the temple. Paul's never going around speaking against the temple. Like, Paul's never going around speaking against the Jewish people. He's not going around speaking against the customs. Like, Paul is actually honoring the customs. Like, he comes into Jerusalem, and as far as we can tell, he honors all of the customs to avoid creating unnecessary offense. And so here, they're lying in this point. So gossip is one thing. Lying is another. Is that they're just outright saying, like, Paul, like here's what Paul was doing, and people are just, and they're just taken aback, and all this uproar occurs. And they're also focusing here on the differences. They're not actually working to understand what Paul is doing. Like, no, doesn't mean there weren't differences, right? Differences in ministry in Jerusalem and outside of Jerusalem. We already talked about it. The elders acknowledged this. James acknowledged this. Paul acknowledged this. They're all saying there's differences. But they're actually focusing on God's working. They're focusing on, like, hey, like we're all pursuing God. They're focusing on this unifying pieces. They're focusing on the differences. Oh, he's hanging with different people. Trophimus. Now, non-Jewish people could convert to Judaism. And yet they're just assuming that Trophimus is like the worst person, and he's not interested in God at all, and he's polluting the temple. And so they're focusing on the differences. And we see, like, sin divides. Like, that God is working, the church is unified, and yet what happens when sin comes in? Sin divides this. He at once took the soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. It seems like there was the fortress in the area was actually adjacent to the temple. And so kind of they're located centrally in the city to be able to handle issues and conflicts. And so they're running down. They're going to get Paul here. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Basically, the crowd that's trying to kill Paul, when they see all the soldiers coming that are armed to the teeth, they're like, okay, hey, we're not going to kill him right now. The tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he inquired who he was and what he had done. Can you imagine this tribune coming up and he's like, okay, like, all of a sudden, like, everything's calm and peaceful. It's a time of festival. And then the whole city's in an uproar. And it seems like this one guy is in the middle of it. So they come down, they arrest Paul. They're trying to put an end to this. Riots were not favorably viewed by the Roman government. They wanted peace and stability everywhere. And so he's coming down. He's like, I got to put an end to this. Stop this thing right now. And he's asking Paul, like, who are you? What have you done? Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another, and as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. This just gives this like idea of how chaotic this was. Like he's trying to understand from Paul, he can't hear over the crowds aren't even agreeing with themselves what's going on. So he said, okay, we're bringing Paul into the barracks here. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of people followed him, crying out, "Away with him." This, once again, just giving the feeling, conveying that feeling of like just the intensity of this moment. Like that Paul is so, now he is bound with chains at this point in time too, but there's just so much pressure from the crowd that basically the soldiers pick him up and just carry him away because of everyone, the crowd's just trying to do away with him. And there's this animosity to this piece. And so Paul here goes in for a day of worship and ends up being shackled and carried out of the temple space in this point in time. But I want to look at briefly at this idea of unity here. It's what the early church was working so hard for, and what ended up getting, as a city, ended up getting fractured as a result of this. Now, defining unity is a little interesting. So, some of the definitions talk about unity, a state of being one. You can see, those of you who are interested in root words like uni, it's like one, unicycle. Can I ride a unicycle? No, I've never tried. Okay. But the idea of one, so it's a state of being one. And I think sometimes when we think that, when we hear that definition, we think of that means we agree on everything. Like we do everything the same, we like everything the same, we dress the same, we think the same, we talk the same. So unity is sort of this monolithic experience. And this is kind of my piece here. I think unity is on the most significant issues. This idea of being one on the most significant pieces. So, for instance, my wife and I are very different people. It's almost comical. We were at a marriage seminar a week or two ago, and they make you take a personality test. And always, we end up on polar opposite spectrums of almost everything, of pace, of personality. I mean, it's almost like you just fill out ours and flip it, and that's mine. I mean, that's how it goes. And we have different styles. We have so many things different. But what works for us is that we agree on the most important things. We agree on what our objectives are for ourselves and our marriage and how we want to communicate. We agree on our objectives, our kids. We agree on that Jesus is at the center of our relationship. And so on the most important things, we have those in common. Now, many of the other things we don't, right? But the flip side is I could share a favorite restaurant with someone, but if they hate my kids and I love my kids, we're not really unified, right? I mean, we might have a similarity, but we're not unified. And so I think sometimes we look at it we think of unity being unity means we all agree on everything, and we're all similar, and we all like the similar things, and we all do the similar things. And yet, I think that misses the point of unity, and even maybe the beauty of unity, is that it's a state of being one on the most significant issues. This does not mean that all the other things that we say are different won't be there. If we remember back earlier in the passage, you have the Gentile church and the Jewish church. And they were one church, but that expression looked very different in Jerusalem than it did in Ephesus. Why did that work? Well, because they were unified on the most important things. That Jesus died and rose again. That anything accomplished was through the power of God. And so whether or not you dressed exactly a certain way, or whether or not you observed the Sabbath a certain way, that wasn't as important. Or exactly what food you ate. Those were secondary issues at best. So we look at this idea of being unified, or the early church working for unity on the most significant things. Well, I think the question comes is is unity a fantasy? I mean, we don't live in a very unified culture. We don't live in a very unified world. Some of our families don't feel very unified. We kind of, and the best picture we have of is actually not unity, it's more like uniformity. The places where we're I'm on a group on social media and we all think the same way, but it's but the group's named after your topic. You know, like you can join like a Harley motorcycle group that says Harleys are the best, and everybody in the group thinks Harleys are the best, you know? Well, are they? I don't know. I mean, I'm not getting into that. Just okay. But what my point is, like, in that group, everybody agrees on that, right? Like, because if you didn't agree on it, you just don't join the group. And so we think of that as unity, and really what we have in that is like uniformity. Like, we have like, okay, if you're in this group, and some of them make you actually fill out questions, like, do you agree to all these stipulations or pieces before you even join? And then once you do, okay, then we have unity. Well, because we just think the same thing on the same issue. If you actually talked in that same group and say, hey, I want to put Harleys aside for a second. Can we talk about parenting philosophy? Or politics or whatever that may be. Like, all this, that unity like blows up. So what we do in our culture is we create groups that are small enough and focused enough that we all get along inside those groups. But if you look around at the church, and not just Grace Point, but the churches across New England and the church across the world, like we're very different. Like we have different service lengths, and we have different approaches, and some are very formal and some are very informal, and we speak different languages and we sing different songs, and some people think like, man, like, I mean, you know, if you got drums, that's the worst. And if someone say if you don't have drums, like Jesus cannot be praised, it gets so complicated. And I think like we get to this piece is like, well, is this idea of unity? Is it just like a fantasy? Is it even achievable? Is it even worth is it one of those sort of pipe dreams that you're like, oh, like someday in heaven this will all happen, it's going to be awesome. But until then, like, deal with a little fighting on earth, you know? Well, John chapter 17, and this is what I like to call the Lord's Prayer, but Jesus here is praying to God the Father. And this is a section of this. But he says, I do not ask for these only, he's talking about his disciples, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. So through the disciples' word, for all those who will believe in me. So if you were today a follower of Jesus, Jesus is praying this over you and over me, which is really cool. What's he praying? That they may all be one. Jesus' prayer to the Father in John 17, which is sometimes called the high priestly prayer, Jesus is praying over us. And he says that if we're in Jesus, that he prays that we be unified. Now, you know, Jesus is not surprised today that we have different personalities. Like, he made us. He's not just surprised that we have different interests. He's not surprised that we have different ages. And yet he's still praying for unity, this oneness. It gets worse. Just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, and so that the world may believe that you have sent me. So it says that he prays that they may be one just as you, Father, and I in you are one. What type of unity does God envision? Well, he designed us for the type of unity that exists in the Trinity, in the Godhead. That he wants the unity of a bunch of very different people to exist in a similar way where it does in the Trinity. Why? So that the world may believe that you have sent me. So God designs the unity of the church to be a sign that Jesus was sent by God. Now, if we say, well, is it a fantasy? Well, I don't know, but it's really important. that on this, like God says, hey, Jesus is asking that the church family be as unified as the Trinity so that everybody that looks on the outside is like, man, like something supernatural is going on. Something that exceeds expectation. Something that exceeds imagination. Something that would just say, like, this has to be divine. That the unity here is so that people believe that Jesus was sent by God. Now, You're like, that feels supernatural, Andrew. Have you looked around? Have you talked to anybody? Have you talked to anybody like online? Have you visited any church? I mean, like there's some weird people out there. Slight alert, if you think it's just weird people out there, you should check the mirror. But yeah, like it's incredible. Like we see this and we're like, wow, like that is crazy. It is supernatural. It's above natural what God is calling for. And yet, that's why it works as a sign. Because if it's just anything that any ordinary person could do with a Facebook group, well, like that's not very supernatural. But if it's bringing a bunch of people who are very different and different personalities and preferences and styles and recharging methods of introvert and extrovert and all these things together, and God could put them into a unified family, well, that's incredible. So the question is, well, how can this be achieved? I like to go to Paul, his letter to Ephesus, the church of Ephesus. He says, I therefore, prisoner for the Lord, he says, I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called. So he's telling the church, he's like, I want you to live in a certain way. This idea of walking is it's not just like a one-time decision and like, whoo, we're good to go, and it's this daily grind. And we know this in certain areas of our life, right? Like if you make a decision on January 1st to be more physically fit during the year, but you don't actually walk that out, nothing actually changes. So what he's saying here is to this church, he says, I want you to walk in a way worthy of to which you've been called. How does this walk look? Well, with all humility. This not inflated opinion of ourselves. It's not thinking like, oh, like I'm the worst person, or it's just being honest with ourselves. That's all we need to do, is just being like honest of where we're at. And gentleness. This idea that, sometimes we're like, oh, we're all prickly when we bump into people. It's like, no, like we're called to walk with gentleness. That others, when they bump into us, whether on accident or on purpose, they don't find us like abrasive and kind of porcupine-ish. That there's some grace that's handled there. With patience, or the idea of endurance. Bearing with one another in love. This is where unity comes. I mean, like, man, you gotta, like, there's some endurance. There's this, sometimes it's challenging, right? Like, no one's saying unity is easy. No one's saying it's like, it's gonna like snap your fingers, it's gonna happen overnight. No, it takes some effort that we endure, that we bear with one another in love. And then he says, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. That Paul says, like, the way I want you to walk is I want you to be eager to maintain unity. We don't always think of being eager, like particularly when you get to the adult stage, as a good thing, But think of eagerness as like kids, the night before Christmas, and they're just like really, really excited. Or maybe like that before a big trip, there's this excitement that builds, and you just can't wait. Or it's like the first day of school or the last day of school, depending on your perspective on this. Like there's this intensity that you're like, man, I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it. I'm thinking about it. I'm rehearsing it in my mind. This eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit. What do we have in common? Well, there's one body, one Spirit. You're called to one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Sometimes we look around and say, I don't have anything in common with that person. But if you're in Jesus, you have the biggest thing in common. You might be different on a couple of small, inconsequential, unimportant things that even you too might change your mind on someday. I mean, there's room for Harley riders to ride BMWs, I'm just saying. But what's way more important than that is that we have the most important things in common. And so even if we never share the small things on earth that seem so important, all of this is what we have in common if we're in Jesus. One body, one Spirit. You're called to one hope. We're not called to different hopes. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God overall. So the question is, we look at this early churches, they work so hard to create unity. Now, outside sin disrupted that. But their efforts were to anticipate the problems and to work towards unity. Paul did that. James and the elders did that. That's what they were working towards. So my question this morning that I want to end with, is the church more unified because I'm a part of it? Is the church more unified because I'm a part of it? Is the church more unified because you're a part of it? So once again, not talking just Grace Point, but the church universal. Is our being a part of the church, do we build that unity? Are we eager to maintain that unity? Do we want to see that unity happen because we want everyone to know that Jesus is real and that God sent Jesus? Or are we part of those that tear it down, disrupt it, interrupt it? Is the church more unified because I'm a part of it? Unity matters to God. Now, this doesn't mean we agree on every single thing, but unity in the most important things matters to God. It should definitely matter to us. Lord, we thank you this morning that you called us to the same Lord, to the same faith. And even where that might be interrupted by time or cultural differences or preferences or language barriers, that in Jesus, we are called into the same family. Thank you for the example of this early church who worked so hard to anticipate and work towards unity. Allow us to be those who create unity through your Spirit. Help us to be the cause of unifying rather than the cause of division. Give us the grace to walk together in love, we pray. And allow us, as we do, to honor you. We pray this in